Kia inui tātou. Kia tata tonu mai pe kia mātou e iho ai no te tēnei hononga ki te purangi me tēnei noho mātou te rānei. Kaupare atu koe ngā wairo kino, ngā wairo poke kia kore ke uru mai i roto i tēnei noho mātou. Engari e hakatau tonu e koe umana ki tanga ki arunga i a rātou katoa mātou katoa. E hono nei atu i te purangi e noho ke nei roto i tēnei noho mātou mo te roanga ki o tēnei rā. Mela ki anō ki ngā kai kōrero ki te taki mai o rātou, take ki mo i te aroro te tēpu. Me te akatau tunu koe o muna ki tanga ki runga i tā mātou kai haka ari ki a tutuki pai ai tēnei noho mātou i te rānei paingano mau, hei paingano mau mātou katoa e whaipānga ane ki tēnei kaupapa. Ko te ino ki tēnei ki a koe pā, mau nei whakamana mai, i runga nei te ngatau ta ma te kai whakora koe i Kraiti. Āmene.
Ata Mārie, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei wāhanga whakamutunga i tēnei wiki. Aku mihi ki taku manuhiri mai Canada, e Rawiri Makitāra. Welcome Professor MacDonald from Canada, the University of Guelph. Nau mai ki tēnei nohoanga o te rōpū whakamana i te tiriti. Welcome to this Waitangi Tribunal sitting. Ko te tūmanako, ka whiwhi koe te kai hei whakaro i a mātou kōrero. So I hope you find our discussions interesting. So welcome. So this morning we have just the one witness for today. We have Dr. McInnes-Ing with us, and is it you, Mr. Vincent, who will be leading her?
Yes, it is.
All right, I will just hand over to you without further ado.
Thank you, Your Honour. Tēnā koutou anō ngā meme o te rōpū whakamana i te tiriti o Waitangi. We have, of course, Professor McInnes-Ing here with us today. She is a plant ecophysiologist and an ecohydrologist who measures and models carbon and water cycling in forests. Her In terms of appellation numbers, her original affidavit is A069. Her reply affidavit is A069D. Her speaking notes for today, A069F. And her PowerPoint presentation is A69G. As part of her preparations for today, she's reviewed the Climate Change Commission's 2026 National Climate Change Risk Assessment and the report of the Parliamentary Commissioner of the Environment, Alt F Reset, examining the drivers of forestry in New Zealand. I don't know if we have an appellation number yet for the 2026 National Climate Change Risk Assessment, but for the Alt F Reset report, that's A043C. Towards the end of her 20-minute presentation, she would like to add a few comments on those reports, drawing on her expertise if she may.
Yes, thank you. That would be helpful.
Thank you. So there are 2 additional slides based on what she's prepared, and I'll file that as soon as I can after she gives evidence.
And Mr. Vincent, just so that we have the appellation number, it's A165 for that risk assessment.
Thank you, Your Honour. All right, Professor McInnes, over to you.
Tēnā koutou ngā mene o te rōpū whakamana i te tiriti o Waitangi. Thank you for the opportunity to respond to the Crown evidence today. I will just go ahead and share my screen because I have a few slides to share. So hopefully that is presenting okay. I will be responding to the written and oral evidence of Robin Julie Collins and Samuel Keenan of MPI and Kirsty Knowles and Catherine Wilson of DOC. So my overarching reflection on the Crown evidence is that there are a number of opportunities that remain to better address climate change and related issues for flourishing biodiversity, ecosystems and communities. So I've framed my response information around what these opportunities are because I think it's good to move forward with positive actions. So starting with the Crown's policies on maximising forest carbon, including the Maximising Forest Carbon Program, I have 4 main points to bring up. So the first relates to the datasets of region-specific information on carbon uptake and storage in native tree species. So Tane's Tree Trust has been working for decades now to collect data that provides more details on the carbon uptake and storage by native tree species across the Motu. But it still remains a very scarce data set in comparison to the information we have available for exotic tree species. Now, this is a known knowledge gap which has existed since well before I moved to Aotearoa 16 years ago. And the lack of data in this space means that we don't really know enough about how native species perform in different parts of the country. And this really influences landholder decisions. So when landholders are making decisions, they want clear evidence and information to help them make informed decisions. And without enough information on native species, then it really pushes the decision-making in favour of the exotic species, particularly radiata pine. So addressing this long-standing knowledge gap will really help to inform decision-making processes. The second item relates to pest control to enhance carbon storage in native forests. And in my written affidavit response, I've included detailed information on the impacts that invasive herbivores have on forest carbon storage. But briefly here, just to explain, browsing by goats, deer, possums, wallabies and other invasive herbivores removes plant biomass, and this reduces the carbon stored in a forest system. And it's in fact more complicated than that too, because it's often the leaves that are consumed, and the leaves are really important for future carbon, not just current carbon, because leaves are the factories for photosynthesis of plants. And so when leaves are removed, this reduces the potential future carbon uptake, and it also reduces growth of plants. So browsers, really affect the carbon storage and also uptake processes. And then they also changed the composition of the forest. In particular, they reduce recruitment of species in future cohorts because the small seedlings and saplings are what they are consuming. And this means that into the future, there aren't sort of the young teenage plants, I guess, coming through the system to take over when the gaps occur. We also see preferential browsing by herbivores, so they particularly like certain species over others. And this means that over time we have a reduction in the biodiversity in the forest because the unpalatable species are really favoured. Now, we know ecologically that biodiverse forests store more carbon, and we also know that forests with high biodiversity are better able to buffer the impacts of drought and fire and other extreme events. So not only do we have a big story around carbon and the biodiversity of the forest, but there's also potential in future climates for these forests to be more vulnerable to extreme events in particular. So while we can say that the current coarse tools that we have available for measuring carbon don't really pick up the carbon storage impacts of the herbivores, it's certain that into the future these will be detectable. And so we do need to be focusing on enhancing the control of invasive herbivores in our forests. The third item involves the issues with pines. And so in my original affidavit in paragraphs 14 to 20, and also my reply affidavit in paragraphs 29 to 36, I did outline a lot of details around the issues to do with radiata pine plantations. So briefly here, just to list those, they include fire risks, vulnerability to wind throw, allergenic pollen production, destruction caused by the harvesting processes of clear felling, which lead to erosion and also issues with slash being carried downstream. The wilding pine problem, high water needs of Pinus radiata compared to native species, which use much less water. We have reduced biodiversity values, and then finally vulnerability to disease and pest attacks. So there is a long list of issues with pines. So transitioning away from pines is really important for future resilience of our landscapes and ecosystems. This will require careful management to avoid poor outcomes in the short term, but we already have some solutions which are available. So for instance, radiata pine can be an effective nursery species for a range of native plants, and passive restoration has been successful in some regions. So by allowing pine plantations to die off naturally as the trees reach old age, we can allow native vegetation to replace the pines where there is suitable nearby forest for seed dispersal by wind and birds and other mechanisms. So while there's still more research to be done in this area, making sure that transitioning away from pines is happening is a really important opportunity to be addressed. And then the fourth option here, or the fourth opportunity, I should say, is the 1 Billion Trees program and the potential that that has. So this was discussed by, in the MPI evidence by Ms. Collins and Mr. Keenan, and it is a program that has successfully supported afforestation, or reforestation, I should say, with native species and improved techniques for production of seedlings of native species. So there's been improvement in processes for reforestation with native species and some expansion in the area of native reforestation happening. So given the agreed success of this program, it's a fantastic opportunity to continue some really good work. And so I would really recommend that this program be extended beyond the original 2018 to 2028 timeframe to keep doing that good work. And further, there is potential to expand the program to make it also include the transitioning away from pine strategy, and also to add some monitoring components to look at what processes are being, what existing activities are being successful. And so that's an opportunity to improve learnings and improve the outcomes of the program even more. I think this is a really easy win for the Crown potentially, because it's an opportunity for climate mitigation, habitat building, and solidification of unstable lands. And so I really think that is an important one to consider. So moving on then to the opportunities in the conservation space. These are relevant to the evidence provided by the Department of Conservation. I have three main points here. The first is the conservation underspend. The second is the limited inclusion of Māori in decision-making about how the conservation funding is spent. And the third is expansion of the conservation program beyond just threatened species management and into more landscape scale approaches. So first, thinking about the spend on conservation. The Department of Conservation is tasked with addressing the combined global crises of biodiversity decline and climate change. It is a massive problem globally, but by their own calculations, the Department of Conservation has been hugely under-resourced by the Crown. So their calculations is that they only get 15% of the budget that they need to adequately undertake conservation. And this is for here and now. We can be sure that in future climates, conservation spend will need to be increased even further if we aren't putting good processes in place to prepare for those future climates. So this is a really important point to make, is that the cost for conservation is only going to increase under changing climate. And so there's a real importance that this is made more of a priority in the Crown's spending activities. The second item has to do with how that limited availability of funds is prioritised. So the careful prioritisation is really important when there's so little money available, but it's really unclear how Māori goals and aspirations for biodiversity and conservation are considered, incorporated and elevated in the prioritisation process. So in the evidence from the Department of Conservation, they talked about the BioInvest tool, and I've just got a diagram here from the website that explains that. The DOC website says it enables us to make informed decisions about the work we choose to do because we can't afford to do everything. So there are 33 programs that contribute to information that goes into the tool, and this is divided up into 6 groups, which is shown in that diagram: ecosystems, species, threats, obligations, knowledge gaps, and support. So there's a lot of information that goes in there, and the website provides some more detail on that. But in terms of looking into how Māori and Te Tiriti are included in this tool, it's not particularly clear from just looking at the website and some other information. Identified 2 programs that would be relevant. Program 13 is managing statutory and non-statutory obligations. And this seems relevant to Māori, but it doesn't seem to explicitly mention Māori on the website. And then program 10 is managing taonga species, which does seem to have inclusion of Māori, but I imagine there's potential for more to be done there. So just to explain that, of the 33 programs that are part of this decision-making tool, there are only 2 that seem that they could be sort of relevant to Māori, and none of them are really highlighting it really well on the website. And so that lack of really clear inclusion of Māori is consistent with the climate change response document that DOC is working with as well. So it's one of these sort of high-level documents or ways of working that is not clearly bringing it through right to the top. I'm also a bit worried about, do we just consult with Māori, or do we actually give Māori opportunities to be part of the decision-making? Because those are different things. So there's a real opportunity there to improve how those processes are being done. And I will say there are some good examples of collaboration between Māori communities and DOC, but those good relationships are not consistent across the motu. Then the third point relating to conservation has to do with the potential for expansion of landscape scale conservation efforts. So currently there are 279 threatened species funded, and this is from the evidence from DOC. And there are 542 nationally critical species in total. So to be able to fund all of these 542 species, DOC would need an extra $55 million. And to cover the needs for all endangered species, they would need a further $144 million. So these are the endangered species that are sort of not included are the ones that are at threat, but not, the highest risk kind of ones. So this is just further evidence of the massive funding shortfall that is a problem for the Department of Conservation. And this is all focusing on individual species. And while that is something that's important to do, particularly for Tonga species, there is potential to do more landscape scale conservation that will actually look after the ecosystem themselves to get sort of better outcomes. So some examples of projects that are happening in this space include the wilding pine management, Predator-Free 2050, and Ngā which is an iwi-led river restoration program. So while the Department of Conservation does have some landscape scale efforts, that needs to be expanded further, because if all of the effort, or some of the effort, I should say, is going into just the threatened species themselves, and those species are living in diminished ecosystems, then the conservation effort in the long run is not necessarily being so great if we're putting out these endangered species into places that are not particularly healthy. So, in summary, I would say there are some examples of good management of climate change threats by individuals and agencies on behalf of the Crown, but these actions are patchy in focus and don't address the complexities of climate change impacts on biodiversity, including the impacts of compound events, the range of indirect impacts, and the fact that many impacts are difficult to detect and therefore remain unknown. So I provided a lot of detail on these kinds of impacts in my original affidavit, and so I maintain that the Crown still has a lot of opportunities to do more work there. So just to summarise my specific recommendations, we need to expand knowledge about native tree carbon storage in different regions and climates. We need to control invasive browsers in forests to maximise carbon capture and storage now and into the future. We need to extend the 1 billion tree program for climate mitigation, native habitat creation, solidification of unstable lands, and enhancement of biodiversity, and also transition away from pine plantations to remove threats and the vulnerabilities of radiata pine. So those are the 4 recommendations relating to the carbon aspects. And then the conservation-related recommendations are to increase the conservation spend to cover more than the minimal 15% of the required budget, to go beyond consultation and to centre the wellbeing and aspirations of Māori communities in conservation decision-making, and to further expand conservation beyond the management of threatened species and really enhance the opportunities for landscape and seascape conservation actions. Now, as Mr. Vincent mentioned, I had a couple of other reflections on these other documents. So this is some screenshots from the Priorities for Action 2026 National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which came out just last month. And this particular report included the 10 most significant climate-related risks that were assessed across Aotearoa. And you can see ecosystems and biodiversity and forestry were 2 of those, and then risks in the Māori world were another one there. So 3 of the top 10 risks are really relating to the biodiversity and Māori situation. So that's just really showing how, what a concern we have in this area. And then I also have some reflections on the, sorry, I've just got everything all over my screen. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report, Alt-F Reset, which was examining drivers of forestry in New Zealand, and this was released in April last year. So the information on here is very expansive and very useful. I imagine the tribunal will find it very helpful, and it's generally consistent with the evidence that I have provided and also my recommendations. But I just have 2 reflections that I wanted to share. The first is that I think the biodiversity values of radiata pine are overstated in this report. And I mention that because I think it's really important that we don't think of radiata pine as providing suitable habitat for native species. So one particular example in this report, they mentioned kiwi living in radiata pine, but we know that kiwi are really vulnerable in drought situations. as they feed by sticking their beaks into the soil to extract food. And during dry conditions, when the soil dries out, the soil really hardens, and because kiwi are not able to get into the soil to get their food, they become now malnourished, and it's really not a healthy situation for them to be in. Now, because radiata pine use more water than native forest species, the pine plantations will dry out faster. The soil in the pine plantations will dry out faster, which means during a drought situation, kiwi become vulnerable faster in the radiata pine than they would be in the native forest. And so it's just one example of the pine potentially being used by a species, but it's not a healthy situation for that species to be in. So the biodiversity values of radiata pine are not good. And then the other point I wanted to say is that I really agree with the focus on the restoration and management of existing forests. So in the response evidence that I've provided, I've really talked about the transition away from radiata pine and other issues associated with that. But I do want to just highlight the real importance of managing existing forests. This is really essential for future climates, and there's real value in sort of carbon and biodiversity add-ons there. One program that's been really successful, that was really successful, I should say, is the Ngā Rākau Taketake. And this was the 3-year surge funding program that was provided by MPI that covered both kauri dieback and myrtle rust. And it funded some really great programs, including Kauri Ora, which was a great collaboration between the Crown and iwi Māori to manage kauri dieback. There was opportunity for capacity building and for research and monitoring and all sorts of great activities to look after kauri forest. Now, kauri are really important in the forest, and they are amongst the most carbon dense forests in the world because kauri wood is really dense and then kauri trees can grow really big. So kauri dieback is in fact a big threat to carbon storage in the forests in the northern parts of New Zealand. So this is just one example of how effective programs can be so successful, but this funding ended in March 2024. So it's been a real challenge for those groups to continue that work without proper resourcing. So finally, I just want to say that meaningful partnerships with mana whenua to address climate change will benefit all New Zealanders through enhanced well-being of te taio and tangata, nature and people. That concludes my presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McInnesing. Mr. Vincent, before we go to Crown questions, do you have any further questions by way of examination in chief?
I don't. No, I don't.
Thank you. We'll hand over to the Crown then.
Tēnā anō, Professor McInnesing. Can you hear and see me?
I can, yes, thank you.
Kia ora. Ko Grace Ely tōku ingoa, he roi o te korona ahau. I just have a few questions for you today about the Maximising Forest Carbon Program and the Department of Conservation's Climate Change Adaptation Action Plan. So the first on the Maximising Forest Carbon Program, at paragraph 11 of your reply affidavit, you refer there to the known direct and indirect effects of herbivory on carbon stocks.
Yes.
And so I understand that one aspect of the Maximising Forest Carbon Program is research to understand how forest management activities can alter forest carbon stocks. And I understand that that research is ongoing. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware that there's some research ongoing, yeah.
And so would you agree that there is still research to be done to understand the impacts of forest management activities, including, for example, pest control, on carbon stocks?
Yeah, I think it's true that there is still more research to be done, but we could have started that research earlier, so there's always potential to... I mean, it's not... The things that are happening, we've known about them for a long time, so it's good to see some research, but there's more that could be done in different parts of the country, different forest systems. So I would say that the research that's happening is perhaps a baseline minimum, and there's potential for a lot more to be done too.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you. But to get to a point of sufficient certainty to inform, for example, possible changes to the ETS, there needs to be integrity in that research.
I think that's true, that research needs to be done well to inform the decision making. I think there's a few aspects to it though, and I know there's a number of groups kind of working on it, and I think that there is potential to sort of do it better to make sure that the best things are happening. But I would also say that even though the research is still being done, it's still clear that there will be carbon gains by making sure we're controlling pests. It's just how those come out in the accounting, which is a different thing. So I think you're sort of, I'm understanding, focusing on how we detect the carbon and how we account for it, which is part of the story. But then there's also we know it's going to have an effect. Let's make sure we're doing the control now as well, because it might take decades for that to come out in the wash.
Yes, I understand. Just in respect of the Maximising Forest Carbon program, though, that is the intended outcome, to understand the carbon accounting, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think we can still do things in the meantime while we're figuring out how to do the accounting.
Sure, thank you. I'll turn now to the Climate Change Action Adaptation Plan. So that's from paragraph 16 of your reply brief. You say there that the plan provides a solid framework as a high-level document, correct?
Yep.
But yes. You note two areas for improvement, and I just wanted to speak to you about the latter of those. And that is that the content on biodiversity in that plan does not capture the complexity of potential biodiversity impacts. So firstly, as a high-level document, and just noting it's only 21 pages long, would you agree that the plan's purpose is to support DOC to prepare for the effects of climate change rather than assessing and capturing all of the potential impacts?
Yeah, I think that's a fair reflection.
And then I just propose to bring one page of the plan up, if my colleague Ms. Downey could do that. And if we could just go to page 12 and perhaps zoom out so Professor McInnes can see the full page. If we could just scroll up to the top. Great, thank you. So this is one of the themes in the plan, and under the theme Prepare, Action 1 is, and if you could just zoom in slightly, please, on the green box. Yes, thank you. So Action 1 is to acquire data, and that action intends to ensure that DOC has the data needed for risk assessments at both a species level and a landscape level. And the plan there refers to the acquisition of biodiversity data and the development of a plan to acquire missing data there in the highlighted text.
Right.
So you refer to the need to understand potential biodiversity impacts in your reply affidavit. Would you accept that this action is a necessary step to understand those potential biodiversity impacts?
You're asking me if the need to do the gap analysis is a part of the step, or?
Yes, does that respond to the concerns you've raised in your affidavit about the plan not addressing the potential biodiversity impacts that may arise as a result of climate change?
I think the need to acquire more data is definitely, I agree with that, but we do already have some information. So I think a document like this should have some acknowledgement of what we already know and some acknowledgement of what those gaps are. I know it's a high-level document, but there is more detail that's available in terms of the fact that there are some direct impacts on certain species, there are indirect impacts. I think doing this sort of gap analysis is not taking into account what we already know and not taking into account what we already know that we don't know, if that makes sense. So we talk about known unknowns, and I think there's potential here to do this in a more nuanced and carefully thought out way. So in terms of my concerns around the document not addressing the complexities of climate change impacts, I still hold that concern, because this material that you're showing me here from the document, it doesn't really capture that. It doesn't provide a clear path forward. So if this is meant to be a guiding document, I'm not convinced that people who are sort of applying this document would really know what they need to do or what information they need to know to figure out what to do, if that makes sense.
It does, thank you. We can take the document down now, please. So my final question is just to confirm you're an expert plant ecophysiologist and ecohydrologist and giving evidence in that capacity.
Yeah, but I also have expertise in impacts of climate change on biodiversity, and I'm a current lead author for the IPCC assessment round 7, so have broader expertise around climate change and biodiversity, but also other impacts of climate change, and also assessing vulnerabilities and looking at adaptation options.
Yes, thank you. So in respect of the issues you've identified in terms of engagement with Māori and provision for Māori in the various policy documents issued by the Department of Conservation, you aren't putting yourself out as an expert in those matters? Well,
I think it's important that I don't speak for Māori. I'm not Māori, but I am a researcher who works with Māori. I collaborate with Māori, I supervise Māori students. So I'm well aware of the fact that I'm not somebody who can undertake kaupapa Māori research, but I'm definitely somebody who would, as I say, collaborate with researchers who are doing those kinds of things. And so in this space, in 2018 and 2019, I was the president of the New Zealand Ecological Society, and during that time there was a special issue of the New Zealand Journal of Ecology, which concentrated on mātauranga Māori and science in the ecology space. And while I didn't author any of those papers, I was involved behind the scenes in securing funding and, working with the team to think about how this could be done in an ethical way. And I do have a paper published with Dan Hikaroa and Tara McAllister, Māori colleagues, on looking at how science and mātauranga can work together. So I definitely won't speak on behalf of Māori in this space, but I will say that as an ecologist who collaborates with Māori, I'm comfortable saying that there's opportunity to do better collaborative work.
Thank you. But just to confirm, is the answer no, that you are not an expert in those matters?
Can you define what you mean by those matters?
You have identified issues in respect of engagement with Māori and provision for Māori in the various policy documents, for example, the CCAAP. So in respect of those matters, would you consider yourself to be an expert? And are you giving evidence in that capacity?
I definitely have lived experience of working with Māori and helping make decisions around conservation with Māori. So if lived experience counts as expertise, and I have published a paper on that kind of space, then I'm comfortable saying that I feel capable to comment on this matter.
Okay, thank you. So your answer is yes to that question?
I think it is, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for your helpful evidence today and in the last hearing week, Professor McInnes. Ka nui te mihi ki a koe.
Kia ora.
Thank you. We haven't had any indications that other claimant counsel wish to put questions, so we now have time for the tribunal panel to ask questions. So I'll hand over to Matua Kevin.
Tēnā koe. In paragraph 16 of your brief, you seem to be highly critical of the fact that DOC's kaupapa is only looking after 4% of the species, the endangered species. If you were in charge, what would you do?
Wow. I mean, that's a really great question, because it's easy to kind of diagnose the problem, but actually coming up with a solution is a different challenge. So thank you for that question. I think when we're focusing just on species, then the ecosystem health can be left aside. I mean, there just needs to be more money put into it so that we can be, undertaking or addressing the issues on a much broader scale. So I guess my main kind of criticism is, or suggestion is, that if the Crown were to put more money into it, then there would be the potential to do much, much better work. So it's about priorities. What are the things that the Crown wants to fund versus not fund? And so maybe one thing I would do is I would definitely be advocating for more funding to go into conservation work, particularly in a changing climate. But in terms of the specifics of on-the-ground projects, I think I'd like to see a lot more collaboration with Māori, because I see so many Māori communities are engaged and wanting to do work. So is that a resource that DOC is missing out on if they're not collaborating well? And I think it's really important from my perspective that I've seen different Māori communities are prioritising different things. So making sure that those actions are happening, within the rōpū of each iwi or hapu, to make sure that they are specific to the ecosystems that are there, the priorities of Māori. There's lots of opportunity there. So, I mean, I know, Matua, you work a lot in the collaborative space, so I'm sure you'd have some good suggestions too. And so the kind of reason I'm highlighting the importance of collaborating with Māori is because of the real opportunities that I think exist in that space.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you. Mother, I just wanted to move to your presentation that you gave on slide 6. You talk about the threatened species and critical species, etc. What's the distinction? I'm not very good at English that well, so can you just distinguish the difference between threatened and critical?
Yes, yeah, nice question. Thank you. I should have explained that further. So there are different levels of threat, and so if species are healthy and functioning well, then they're at the lowest threat level. They're of no concern, and so we don't need to worry about them. Those are the common species that are doing well. And then there's a next level up from that, which are ones that have got a bit of threat happening, but they're doing mostly okay. And then there's the critically ones.
Can I interrupt you? Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you give an example of our threatened species?
I'm not really great on the levels of for particular species, but if we think of, say, kauri as being a threatened species, so globally that's been identified as one of the third most threatened conifer species in the world. Okay. So from a global assessment by an overseas group, that was found to be, of all the global conifers, it was the third most threatened, because of logging and also kauri dieback. Yeah. And so that's a species that's been identified globally as being threatened. And then here in Aotearoa, we also have our own kind of categorisation of the different species. And so I'm concerned that if I start naming species, I'll get them wrong. I'm not really
you've given one, that's
enough.
What about a critical species? What's an example of that?
So the critical ones are the ones at the lowest numbers, and so that might be kakapo is an example. So there's been lots of intensive work going into kakapo, and lots of success there too, with the increase in the population size of kakapo through the really careful management of that as a species. So that is an example of a species that's had a lot of work done on it. It's very critical, and they've had good outcomes. And then there are the lower level species that are not getting as much attention. They're not being funded. And often we see lots of attention given to bird species, and those are the iconic species, but far less attention given to plant species. And so there's a real imbalance as to where that budget goes to in terms of looking after the rare and threatened species.
So it's birds like the fairy tern, the black robin, those sort of species.
Yeah, I'm not sure which ones are being managed by DOC. I didn't read up on that, but I'd be happy to take a further question in writing if that would help.
No, it's fine. I just want to move to your recommendations on slide 7. The first recommendation, you're mindful that part of the reason for pine was because the native trees are more slow growing. You're aware of that, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Now, and the third one, you talk about the 1 billion tree program. Do you know how much is left in that kaupapa, or how many trees have already been planted and how much is left?
Well, I understand all of the funding has been allocated, and then MPI they did have a counter on their website that sort of showed how many they were up to. I think there was some evidence from Miss Collins or maybe Mr. Keenan on that, but I could get back to you on that if it helps.
I do recall it. Okay. That's all my questions. Thank you very much, been very helpful. Thank you.
All right.
Ms. Kapua, do you have any questions?
No, thank you, Mum. I don't have any questions. Thank you.
All right, I'll hand over to Professor Williams.
Ata Māori, Professor. Is your plea in paragraph 40 of the 69A document, Crown needs to invest in more research, monitoring and actions to address the combined crises of biodiversity and climate change. But you're also aware that for the last 2.5 years at least, successful research funding grants are going to depend on showing that one of the pillars is economic growth. So researchers for decades seeking contestable funding have always got to find ways of trying to meet the criteria that are current. You'd be familiar with that over the years. University researchers, CRI, they've changed their name, what was Crown Forestry, Crown Research Institutes and independent researchers all have to meet whatever the criteria is. So I'm wondering how you can frame research which will tick the economic growth box and at the same time meet the objectives you're talking about. So that slide that Matua has just referred to, recommendation 2 is control invasive browsers in forests to maximise carbon capture and storage now and in the future. And well, for a start, I'm very grateful for the pejorative term invasive herbivores, because I have a distinct dislike of all of those creatures out in the wild, deer, goats and possums, and I see far too many of them close to my lovely caravan in the bush in the Hokianga. And so I've now got a pejorative term, collective term for them. They're invasive herbivores. So do you think that researchers like yourself and others can, instead of just complaining about the government changing the rules, say, well, look, they want me to frame as economic growth. Is maximising carbon capture and storage now and in the future something that might tick that box?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and always a struggle for people working in kind of conservation biology, and it's just getting harder, as you mentioned. I think it helps to sort of zoom out a bit. So last week I was in the Bahamas at the lead author meeting for Working Group 2 for the IPCC Assessment Round 7, and this was our second lead author meeting. So we're moving into the first order draft for this report, which will be due in 2028. And so this report stretches across all areas of impacts, vulnerability and adaptation that are, happening globally, with, over 20 chapters delving into all of the material. And I think one of the things that's really coming out, to my mind and to others, is just the absolute importance of healthy ecosystems to underpin our responses to the changing climate. And so it's really challenging to, be thinking on kind of 3-year funding cycles or 3-year political cycles in terms of needing to look at these things long term and in the bigger picture. But if we want to address climate change, and if we want to, use the options that are available in terms of avoiding the worst of the climate impacts through mitigation, but also through adapting, then looking after our ecosystems has to be, part of that. They're just so important for underpinning what's going on. So nature-based solutions is something that's, kind of been in the literature for a while now, and it's really about, I guess, using nature to kind of heal the climate kind of thing. And that's had varying levels of success. There's some critique of that, but I think there's real benefits in terms of, I guess, showing the economic importance of healthy ecosystems and how that feeds through to all the other kinds of health that we want. So economic health relies on biodiversity. Health of humans relies on biodiversity. Everything comes back to the health of ecosystems and the biodiversity that underpins those. So I think, we're working on different ways to articulate that. We can be kind of sceptical or cynical, I should say is the word, around saying, we can, do some rough calculations and justify our research. So I think we're going to see more cynical proposals coming through, people saying things like, this is really going to solve climate change when perhaps it's not, or things are a long way down the track. I think the current funding climate is not going to bring about the best research because it is focusing on areas, or it is heavily directing funds towards areas that are still emerging and might not be successful, whereas in the conservation space, nothing that I have suggested is kind of new or novel or controversial. I think it's all, or pretty much a no-brainer to me. So I think that is a problem, though, like you're identifying, in that if it's not seen as being, cutting edge or, impactful in a next year kind of thing, it needs to be long-term investment. But I think to some extent, that's why approaches used by Māori are seen as being appealing, because they are such long-term approaches. I see climate change plans from iwi which are looking 100 to 200 or more years into the future, and that's how we need to be thinking. And so that's why, I think DOC collaborating with Māori is so important, because Māori are taking these long-term views and plans. So I'm not sure if that quite answered your question, but that's what comes to mind.
We'll see whether the questions are answered by looking at your next research applications and see how you manage it. So clearly you're not very much of a fan of the other invasive species, Pinus radiata, and at least you may have noticed that the Minister of Finance agrees with you on wilding pines, something in the budget yesterday, I believe. But I want to ask a question about your criticisms of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, ALT-F reset report, which you included in your presentation this morning. And you talked about the Kiwi having difficulty with hard-baked earth. My understanding of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report is not particularly in favour of pine as such, in terms of plantation pine, but that permanent forest pine does the immediate erosion control in vulnerable areas, and does the carbon sequestration quickly, and eventually leads to a native reversion where your kiwi will get on perfectly fine if they're still around. So have I got the Parliamentary Commissioner's view correctly paraphrased there? And do you really think that we should not use any pine at all, even in permanent forestry?
Well, I think that the part to I wanted to raise the biodiversity issue because I think there's been, I was concerned that could be taken on its own and misread, so misinterpreted. So that's why I wanted to kind of just point out that it's slightly simplistic, the information on the biodiversity values of the pines. But coming back to your broader question around the sort of suggested approach from that report, I do have a similar understanding, but I think what's missing from it, from my, reading and from my knowledge, is the thinking about the extreme events and those impacts they can have. So if we have fire ripping through the forest that's meant to be a permanent forest, it takes, all the carbon goes back to the atmosphere. It loses the carbon value that it was supposed to have. So I would prefer we didn't plant pines because we know that they are more flammable than the native species. So we might be prioritising the pines for the carbon in the short term, but in fact it's a false decision-making process because when the fires happen, they will just take out the carbon, and even though it's been taken up faster than the native forest, it will be removed straight away anyway. So we're not thinking about that fire aspect to it much at all, and I didn't see much at all about the fire component. And the fire weather is getting worse here in Aotearoa, and it's only a matter of time before we have those massive fires like we see in Australia and North America and even Europe and all over the world. So, that's why we need to move away from the pine. It's the fire, but it's also the wind throw and, all the aspects, all the issues with pine are going to be worse under climate change.
Good, thank you. So is there any, I don't suppose you can have research data on the fire risk because we haven't changed the climate badly enough yet to increase it to North American standards, so to speak. Is that right?
There has been some analysis on the fire risk, yes, and it's going to increase in New Zealand. There are some researchers who work on that. I could come back with some written information if that would be helpful.
Yes, fire risk is something that would be important. There has been some examples in Hawke's Bay recently and so on. So if you can treat that as a written question from me, as a question from me to be answered in writing by you on the fire risk research, that'd be useful.
So there's been some analysis from the climate perspective, which is part of it. So that the climate component is things like the dry weather, the dry weather, the wind, and the warming temperatures. And then that interacts with the plants, and that's when they're drying out, and then they become more flammable. So there's interaction between the weather itself, which is what the climatologists measure, and then what happens in the forest system, which is more what I kind of measure in terms of the flammability of the plants, but also how that changes under particular conditions. So you can imagine when a drought occurs, the plants dry out and then they just burn more easily and the fire is more fierce. So are you interested in more details on those aspects?
Yes, just a bit of research data on that would be really good. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So those are my questions. Thank you very much for your evidence.
Kia ora.
Thank you, Professor McInnes. Everyone seems to have picked the same questions to ask. I've just got one more, and that is in relation to, you mentioned in, I'm not sure which page of your PowerPoint presentation it is, but it's got the heading Opportunities for Conservation, and you've mentioned some landscape scale successes, including iwi-led Ngā Awa, have the opportunity for expansion, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because we have been hearing a lot of bad news stories here, so it would be good to hear something good to end our week on.
Yeah, so Ngā Awa was actually mentioned by Ms. Knowles in her evidence as an example of the Crown activities. So it's not a project that I'm deeply aware of, but there is, I did a Google and kind of found it, and it looks like a really promising, a great collaboration on a particular area, because it's locally based, it's about a particular issue, it's focused on, working together and collaborating. It's just a beautiful example of how the Department of Conservation can work together with iwi in some places around the Motu, and shows that there's further opportunity to do that a lot more with, good relationships with, all the iwi across the Motu. Then that's, I think, a nice example of how things can work in a positive way.
All right, thank you for that. I'm just checking my notes to see. I've got a note here now which I'm not really understanding myself, and it was when you were talking about the transition away from pine, and I've got the words passive restoration and a question mark. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So in restoration approaches, they can be really intensive, where there's lots of human intervention. And so when we go out and plant trees, that's an active approach, where the seeds are collected and then the plants are grown up in a nursery and then they're taken out into the field and planted. That's really labour intensive and quite expensive. Passive approaches are where we kind of almost let the land heal itself. And here in Aotearoa, often that involves just fencing it off from, cows and sheep and letting it return, or also undertaking sort of pest control can be part of that as well. And through those passive processes, where there is a nice nearby patch of, native forest, then the seeds will disperse by wind and also by birds and other processes, and they'll just come in and start growing in the area. So passive restoration is much cheaper. It can take longer, and it does really require there to be a nice kind of forest nearby to provide the source of the plants. But there's lots of opportunity to be doing passive restoration as a process for recovery of pine areas.
Yes, I do recall there was a program called Ngā Whenua Rāhui where money was given to Māori Land Trust to fence off areas of native forest to conserve and preserve them. And I'm not sure what's happened to that program, but it was a way of, if it could have been expanded in the way that you're suggesting in terms of passive restoration, because it was often done in areas where the opportunities for economic farming were minimal. It would be nice if that could have been expanded, but I'm not sure what's happened to that program. All right, well...
it's not one I'm familiar with, but
yes.
It's a good one, yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your evidence, Professor. I'll hand you back to your counsel in case there are any questions by way of re-examination.
No, there aren't, but thank you from me too, Professor.
Kia ora.
Yes, so thank you again. We've enjoyed your evidence very much. Thank you, especially that you've given recommendations, which helps us with our considerations as well. So that ends the evidential part of our hearings. We have closing submissions to come. There are a few matters that I can give you some information on. During the judicial conference, this is for counsel, during the judicial conference I mentioned the issue in regard to the availability of the transcripts. I can say that the hearing week 4 transcript is not too far off, as they're just finishing day 5 of that hearing week. In terms of hearing week 5, that has been completed, so it should be sent out very soon. In terms of hearing week 6, the National Transcription Service is about to get started on that one, and we've got no word in relation to hearing week 7. And there will be changes to those settings if there are more urgencies to transcribe and so on. So that's just giving a time frame for those transcripts. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of Professor McInnes-Eng's evidence that the full risk assessment report is A165, and I can also give the number for the priorities for action risk assessment report, which is A25F at pages 74 to 210 of Professor Naish's bundle. So those are just some admin things to finish off the week. Can I just thank Council for helping us to manage this week. In terms of the evidence, we've had wonderful evidence from very high quality witnesses. So I'm very appreciative of that, as is the panel. So we have a lot of very interesting and thought-provoking evidence to consider, and no doubt Council will be able to help us with that in terms of the closing submissions when we finally get to them. So can I thank everybody for bringing that evidence before the tribunal. And also, can I, before I forget, can I thank Alan, our technical person, our technical magician, and also our staff for the really titanic efforts that they have to go through to keep us on the road. So with those thanks, I'll just hand over to our kaumātua to close for us.
Kei nei tātou. E te ata kārawa, e te ata ātawhai, e tuku tunu mātou tēnei reo whakawhetai, whakamoemiti ki a koe pā, mō ngā tini manaakitanga, i uhe mai e koe ka rungi a mātou, i tēnei hononga ki te purangi, ki tēnei noho mātou te rāne, engari mai rāno i te mane kua taha ke nei taino ki tēnei haura hakamutunga. O tēnei tunu te whakapeta i te whakamoemi te tauinga tapu e pā, me te whakaoketu te kroria ki a koe, me te ina tiki a koe ke manaki tēnei koe tēnei o mātou, e wehe tiki o mātou kāinga, e wehe tiki o mātou tūhoutanga, e wehe tiki o mātou mahi, wai au tunu koe te hātau ai reo tapu ki runga nei tēnei whare ki runga ngā āpia ki te whakatutuki ngā mahi mo i a rātou, kia puta kene pai ngānu ki te whakatutu ki te kau tēnei kaupapa. Te weku e ne o ki ngā inoi ki a koe pā mau ne whakamana mai. I runga nei te ngā tāu tama te kai whakora koe i koraiti. Amen. Kia ora tātou.